Hello and welcome to this brand new episode of In Session, Bennington to Montpelier. I am so happy to be joined today by Representatives Mary Morrissey, Jonathan Cooper, and David Durfee. And I am your host, Jack Rossiter-Munley, coming to you from the Bennington County Multicultural Community Center here in beautiful downtown Bennington. Welcome, legislators.
Good
Good
morning.
morning.
Well, good morning.
I would like to get us underway with what is, I'm guessing, the biggest thing on many people's minds right now, and I'm also guessing the biggest thing on all your minds, which is the state budgeting process. It's going at a fast and furious pace. I think even people who are in the know and might be looking at some of the bill trackers will see the flurry of activity even within a single day on the various House and Senate bills. So I just want to get us started off for anyone who might want a little bit of demystification about how things go at this stage in the budgeting process. And I'll put it over to you first, Representative Durfee, just to talk a little bit about what is the House, Senate, and Governor kind of back and forth process looking like at this stage in the state budgeting process.
Uh, sure, I can address that sort of how it looks like generically in a typical year, and then and I'm sure Mary Morrissey, who's Representative Morrissey, can fill in any gaps just because she's seen so many more budgets and been through it so many more times. And then, talk about it, just what does it look like this year too. But yeah, so we're nearing the end of our session, and the very last thing that the legislature does every year is pass the budget. Typically, we do that, and then we're able to leave. And we time things to make it work that way. It may be a little bit different this year. We can come back to that. But the budget process begins in the fall, or perhaps even earlier. So going back now to sometime late last summer, the governor would have asked his all the different departments to come up with their proposed staffing levels, programs, salary changes, benefits, and so forth, and put it all into a budget for each agency and department. And then that all gets turned in, and then the governor and his direct staff, weed through that and come up with a budget that's balanced. We don't have a requirement in Vermont for a balanced budget, but by tradition, we've always agreed that that's what we're going to do. The trick is then to try and guess, well, how much revenue are we going to have? And then we'll build a budget that balances to that revenue. And of course, that's not an exact science, but we have economists who work for the state who will project, here's how much income the state will have. And then we build the budget to match that. So that forms then in early January, the governor comes to the legislature and says, here's my proposal for a budget. And he's constitutionally required to do that, or at least statutorily required. It's not that it's custom there. It's in the law that the governor needs to kick things off. But then it's up to the legislature. The legislative branch, both in at state levels and at the congressional level, decides how much money we're going to spend and how we're going to spend it. And then it's up to the executive branch, the governor, to actually carry that out. But it should be, the legislature's decision. And I will say that, of course, the legislature is not a single person. There's 150 of us in the House, and then there's the Senate with 30 other people. So there's lots of different ideas and perspectives. So somehow we have to come to compromises internally. The House does that first. We did that back in early March, sent our proposal to the Senate. They have then tried to come to their own set of compromises, and they have a slightly different version, I will say, from the House. And then the next step is for the House and Senate to get together. That's about to happen. So this yesterday or 2 or 3 days ago, the Senate said, here's our version. The Senate and the House have each selected 3 of their most expert members on budgeting to get together, not in secret. This is all done in public. The public, it's shared over Zoom and YouTube. Individual members of the public can go and sit in if they want to actually travel to Montpelier. We can all sit in as legislators and follow what's happening, and then that process takes place over the course of several days typically. So there'll be negotiations held in public, and then the House will go back to its members and say, here's where we are, and the Senate might do the same, and then ultimately come up to an agreement. And again, this is all within the confines of a balanced budget. So the conversation typically isn't about how much are we going to spend, but how are we going to spend it? What's going to be prioritized? And then if we can reach that agreement, then the governor does have to weigh in, gets to weigh in one more time. So again, the governor started the process, and then the governor wraps things up by signing the budget, or if there's something that he or she strongly disagrees with, not signing it and vetoing it. In other words, saying, nope, I'm not going to accept this. You need to start over again. We can get into a long conversation about the governor's veto authority. The Governor Scott has tended. I think he holds the record for the number of vetoes, and perhaps like the number of vetoes that he's done, I think maybe matches all in history of other governors of Vermont, and that's partly just a function of how long he's served and the fact that he's a governor of a different party than the majority of the House and Senate. But in any case, we just, again, we always do a balanced budget, and things are a little bit odd this year because we had quite a bit of revenue left over, or we will have a lot of revenue left over this current year. And the question is, how do we want to spend that money? And whether we want to put it towards education, property taxes, or for other good programs. Weighing in this year, we all need to remember that the federal government, which supplies more than a third of our total revenue. So when we're talking about trying to project what will next year look like, it's always a bit of a guessing game for the economists. But now we have to factor in: are we going to get this federal money that has always been available to states? Medicaid funding, transportation, highway funding, education funding, and each of those three, there's a real concern, I think a legitimate concern based on what we've heard out of the Trump administration, in some case threatening that if states don't do this, we're going to withhold money. If states have certain policies that may have nothing at all to do with Medicaid or transportation or education, we're going to withhold the money. So that's looming over the whole process. And maybe others would like to weigh in.
Yeah, I do want to, as you mentioned, Representative Morrissey has a lot of experience with this process. And so I do want to go to you next, Representative Morrissey, to talk a little bit about how this year looks the same or different from processes past, both within the sort of regular state level process that Representative Durfee described, but then with these kind of new and uncertain external pressures that are shaping the conversation.
Well, let me back up. David did a very good job in laying out the process or the roadmap that is taken to get to the budgets. And this year, yes, there is a great concern as we've worked through the budgets. The money committees are technically appropriations. Also, the transportation committee, as well as my committee, which is institutions and corrections. And, the other committees have money type bills within, but not major bills like the three I mentioned. Right now we are at the pivoting point where bills are like yesterday. I sat in the afternoon after my committee finished for the day and listened to the Senate report our institutions and corrections bill on their House floor and the debate that went on about that. Yes, there were some differences within both of our presentations of what we thought was important based upon what the governor originally had, as David had explained, put forth as his budget. We also, transportation, their budget is now going to conference committee, and like David explained, 3 members from the House were chosen. I believe it was yesterday, and I'm sure the Senate chose as well their 3 members. You know, and we do that with the appropriations bill, which and that will have also the conference committee going on. So there's a lot of pieces in flux. You also have to remember that while those budgets are being addressed and by conference committees, you've got other committees dealing with bills that still have some funding, you know, attached to them. So that all has to get incorporated. You know, right now there's a significant housing bill that's being considered. Healthcare, we've got some tremendous, and not tremendous in the positive sense, but tremendous in some concerning issues with healthcare, as we're all aware, that's happening with the finances for health, you know, for our hospitals and healthcare in general. So, and then of course we have the education bill that we're waiting to hear what the whole package is from the Senate. And so there's lots of moving pieces right now to get, you know, to the end line of the session. Now, in the years that I've served, you know, I have seen adjournment anywhere from the first week in May to usually what it's predicted to be is the middle of May. And this year they are saying it could go as late as you know, into June. David was exactly correct. The uncertainty of what Washington, of the federal government, that is very tied to our budgets, is going to do, is very concerning, because like David said, it is a third of our budget, and how would you look to address or fill those needs or those budgets for the needs of our Vermonters? Very concerning. I think this year the bill that also is going to possibly, I don't want to say hold up, but is still in discussion is, you know, the education bill. And like David did say, usually it's the minute the appropriations bill is approved, that's usually the time of adjournment. And I think this year what will hold things up will be the education bill. And it will be interesting how that comes back. I believe it will be in stages, and this is a bill that has to be very carefully and thoughtfully put out there. This past Monday, Senator Seth Bongartz and Senator Rob Plunkett put on a meeting at the high school for teachers and education personnel that could come, as well as there were some of us as legislators there to listen to their presentation and kind of to hear what the Senate has to say. But that is a piece that, you know, I look at it like that we have an opportunity, but we have to do this extremely carefully. My first year, 29 years ago, was at the time when Act 60 was created, and that was concerning because it was difficult, and even today, people still will say it's hard to explain all the different pieces of it. So I'm hoping going forward and working with all the committees of jurisdiction, whether it's finance, the education committees themselves, you know, ways and means, how we're going to fund it. I mean, there's usually 2 or 3 or 4 or more committees that will take a piece of some of these budgets to weigh in on, but it's a little bit much more complicated this year with all the concerns with, you know, the funding. So I will leave it at that so that others can speak, but this is a bit of a whirlwind right now, and we are in what I would say are the final stages to us getting to adjournment. And I'm hoping that, and you hate to base a budget on hoping, but I'm hoping that, you know, the federal government will be working with us to make sure that the funds that we normally get to help fund our programs is there.
I definitely want to return to some of the conversation around education, but I do want to quickly, before we sort of wrap up on some of the budget discussions, both Representatives Morrissey and Durfee, you mentioned that a lot of what this comes down to is a little bit less the top line number of the budget, though that is important, but sort of the funding priorities within it. I think the two different numbers that have been out there are the governor's budget being around 8.99 billion and the legislature's budget being closer to 9.01 billion. So not a huge difference, though a large number, not maybe in the context of those two numbers, but large for any of us who maybe look at our household budgets. But what are some of those funding priority differences that are kind of coming to discussion points between the House and the Senate, and then will be those points with the governor? Representative Cooper.
So, I think that very well, what you talk about has a lot to do with which committee you're in, and knowing that appropriations, Ways and Means have that sort of global perspective on the budget. But something, for example, In House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development, one of the things we're looking at, so we're looking at the Senate proposal, and we're seeing that some numbers around our downtowns and tax credits, our historic preservation tax credit program, and other programming that's associated with that. You know, as you said, we have I guess, a $0.02 billion difference between governor and some legislative stuff, but one of the things that's sort of important here has to do with how we would fund ways in which the Agency of Commerce and Community Development provides support to small businesses. So there's several $100,000 that was articulated in the governor's budget that that funding was not found for. And the question is, all right, well, how will we help out, say, the Small Business Technical Assistance Exchange that had been run by the regional development corporations? What can we find for the small business, the Vermont Small Business Development Center? You know, that they had some micro lending, micro business assistance that was sort of specified and then came to have like a number attached to it. The Professionals of Color Network, another, you know, in each case, these are all six-figure appropriations that would be funding a year's worth of work. In some instances, there is an individual who'd be hired and brought on board. In other cases, it's really task oriented, where we're going to develop this resource guide for small businesses, for people who are looking to start up businesses, people who are looking to transfer, say, sell their business and looking to retire off of that. So, you know, it gets programmatic pretty fast. And as you might imagine, anytime we talk about relatively small differences in multi-billion-dollar budgets, we get in the weeds real quick because they're relatively minor. And I think that you'd find these conversations happening in all committees. You know, I think we had heard at the outset about our motel sort of general assistance program that we're looking to. I think there's a lot of broad agreement with both, you know, in the executive office, within the legislative offices, around the V Hearth sort of program, something that is looking to assist people not just by continuing to rent a room, but by working through a process by which one can acquire their own, you know, have their own standing, have their own place. And that's something that we're sort of looking to shift from from one way of assisting to another way of assisting. And I think there's a lot of broad agreement between the three, you know, the House chamber, the Senate chamber, and the governor's office on the fifth floor next door. But it's a matter of, okay, how do we get these details to work? And I am appreciative of the committees of conference that will be, you know, it gets a little bit, I've been told my first time around, but it gets a little bit hairy as you think you're going into your committee room, but there's a committee of conference in your committee room, and the conferees, they have that room. So you have to find someplace else to go continue your policy discussions if you're on a policy committee. So it's, I am, for example, being in commerce and economic development, really sensitive to the good work that regional development corporations and the Agency of Commerce and Community Development have been doing with small business developments, with entrepreneurial sort of assistance, technical assistance, I should say, and trying to reach all corners of the state and all types of business people. And so that involves translation assistance sometimes, that can involve a lot of different things that may not cross our minds at first, and why it's so valuable to take testimony from witnesses who are doing the work on how we can reach, with this amount, we can reach these 5 people. With a little more, we could reach 40. And, you know, that kind of multipliers is really important. We were just talking yesterday about something called an initiative called Maple Mountain, looking, it does at this time does not have a funding attached to it in the budget. Maple Mountain would assist in the development of residencies for new physicians in primary care in rural areas, specifically targeting rural areas and federally qualified health centers, FQHCs. The nearest one to us in Bennington County, one is in Bennington County, and it's in Arlington. That's the Battenkill Valley FQHC. But the point is that in an era of specialization in medicine, general practitioners offer really good bang for the buck. They are some of the most productive members of our medical realm. And for example, $500,000 this year would help. I think it's up to 12 new residents be distributed across the state. And ordinarily, if you're doing a residency through, say, UVM, or you've completed your medical school studies, now it's time for the residency program. You're probably not from Vermont originally. So we're finding ways to bring people to the state who have productive careers that mean a lot to us. And we're trying to find ways to, over the next, coming 4 years, give them some funding so that they can do a lot of the recruitment. And once they're in an FQHC, they're billing and that people are utilizing their services. It's not paid for through taxes. It's something that generates revenue for the state within communities. And people are generally, if you complete a residency somewhere, you're very likely to stay in that area. And so that's something that we're projected to need by 2030. Our shortage there is over 300 primary care physicians. That's the projection, and that's a problem. We can't lose 300. A lot of times it's because, and I think, David, you know this quite well, in Shaftesbury, the local doctor, somebody that knows everybody, you form a lot of trust over a long period of time. And we're seeing a lot of those individuals retire because it's time to retire. But no one's there to take on, to acquire the practice, to take it on. And so we're really trying to address that one bit at a time. And so there's just one small example, Jack, of a program that is sort of we're talking about right now. I know there's some bigger picture, maybe policy decisions between the governor and the legislature, but that's one that's been in my committee and offering a little peek. And I think each of us serving on different committees, there may be other peaks that we can have into what are those, that last little bit of reconciliation. And it isn't, it's an academic exercise, but it's also one that does impact what we see in the next fiscal year as residents of the state, as people that consume the services that the government assists with or funds. So it's always good to have some of those examples in mind.
As someone who records this show sitting at a chair and at a table that used to be at the Shaftesbury Medical, that example definitely hits home because that is an office that used to be operating and now is not. And that does open a lot of questions, and primary care is a major issue. And I think that point is very well taken and important, where budgets are a snapshot in time. They capture the pressures and the needs of the moment, but those needs can also be about looking quite a few years down the road and trying to be prepared for what's coming. One more quick question just about this process, picking up on something that both Representative Morrissey and Cooper mentioned, which is that maybe these conference committees are taking over your committee space, but also Representative Morrissey going to listen in on the Senate conversations. How often and how much do legislators make it a point to sort of sit in at this stage in the process just to be aware of maybe on the House side what the Senate is doing, if you have the time and you're available outside of your committee work, or trying to sit in on some of those conference committee discussions? Representative Durfee.
I'm sure it varies tremendously. I will say that I have in the past sat in, but not this year. And it's partly a function, I think, just of what my own schedule is like, and added to that the convenience of being able to use the legislative website to track things in a way that we weren't able to do all that long ago. So, for example, last night on the ride home, I was a passenger in a colleague's car, and I was curious to see how the Senate Education Committee had wrapped up their day. They're dealing with the education bill that Representative Morrissey made an allusion to a little while ago, and so I was able to see. Oh, in fact, they have finished, and was able to watch their the last 10 minutes of their meeting to see that they had voted out that bill, which wouldn't have been able to do obviously a few years ago, and um, that's how I often am checking in on things, and it's just very easy to track, in other committees too, how things are moving forward. The committee rooms are small, so from a practical standpoint, you get a few folks who are particularly interested in hearing what's going on in influencing perhaps what's going on, it doesn't always leave a lot of room for the rest of us to jump in there too.
I think that's also a point well taken for anyone who's interested in the process, which is how easy it now is, no matter where you are in the state or indeed the country, to hear not only, to get news from news sources that are online, but to see the actual deliberations of the committees, which are available online, and shows like this. Let's not sell ourselves short. I do want to move on to talking about some of the sort of national headline grabbing things that have been going on in the state in the last few weeks. I think most notably the arrest of Mohsen Mahdawi at his citizenship interview, and what in the past week has been his subsequent release after a large outpouring of support from his own community and people from around the state of Vermont. There is also the ongoing question of whether Rameza Ozturk, who was briefly held in Vermont and then sent to Louisiana, will be returned to Vermont. There has been the order for her to be returned, and then a subsequent order from the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals that will hear the case coming up on Tuesday the 6th about whether or not she will return to Vermont. But obviously these events bring sort of national conversations home in a different way. And the nature of the support that came out for someone like Mohsen Mahdawi, where you had members of both political parties, a large group of interfaith people coming up to the Capitol to show their support, gives a particular sort of flavor to the response here in Vermont, I guess, to this kind of action happening here in the state. And so, naming something that I think many people are aware of, and not to put too fine a point on it or to put you on the spot, but Representative Morrissey, you are the only person in the Bennington delegation with an R next to your name. So I will start with you on this one. How are you sort of feeling and responding to these events, and what are you also hearing from sort of other members of your party within the state about what this sort of looks like for them, and how that is shaping their thinking?
Well, I've always believed, and it doesn't matter if you have an R or a D, you look at the situations for what they are. And I obviously always want a due process, a fair due process for everyone, no matter what the issue is. And, there has been some very questionable concerns, as has been shown by citizens across the state. And I think we always have to look at our laws and what we should expect. And again, like I said, a respectful process for everyone and a due process. And it has been, concerning to see more than concerning where this has gone with, has there been the lack of a process? And obviously, many of us, think that it's very questionable, and that there should be not this struggle for folks to have to be concerned with, possible incarceration or other things. We dealt we didn't deal with it within our committee, because at one point there was a question about holding several folks, immigrants, within our prisons. And, that is normally would not be a process that would happen. And so, within our committee discussion, institutions and corrections, we discussed it a bit, but, our concerns was the federal government going to, with the state, try to, have like, us holding and how, the whole thing was just very, upsetting, to think that, we were at this stage. But, again, I will just reiterate, no matter what the issues are, and again, for me, it doesn't matter what party you are, there has to be a due process that's respectful for everyone. And, that's how I've always felt. So, I'll leave it at that.
And I think that's something that shows up in a lot of different realms of political life in Vermont, where the party affiliations don't matter in the same way that they often do, certainly on the national level, but even in other states. It's something that I think every single guest on this show has articulated, just in terms of what the nature of the collegiality at the Capitol looks like between legislators. In the sort of wake of Mohsen Makhtawi's arrest, one of the most vocal people was the lieutenant governor. And that had nothing to do with his party affiliation. That had to do with his relationship to this issue. And so that is something that I think has been recognized nationally about the way Vermont has responded. And I'm curious, Representative Cooper, as a new legislator coming into the legislature, I know I've checked in with you a couple of times. Just how has that been? We are in an interesting time with the balance in the legislature between the parties. But just what have you been seeing on the state level in terms of how these sort of national issues and conversations coming to the state level, what has that looked like amongst legislators, and what are legislators talking about as possible statewide actions to help residents feel safe?
My cat has walk-in privileges, so you may she's 16 now, so I can't, she may show up. I think that one of the things that the incoming class has made a point of doing, there's 50 of us, and I think as I mentioned, maybe 3 or 4 had previously been legislators and are returning, but more than 45 of us are brand new. We've made a point of trying to get together once a month, and just all of us. And one of the things that's really valuable to me about those events, I mean, I like the people, we chat. That is one of the only times that I'm in a room where Democrats are not in the majority. And that's an important thing for me to experience, and to remember that when my Republican colleagues will come to the legislature, or they'll go into their committee rooms, there's more Democrats than Republicans. And and I've had a couple of conversations with some of my, newcomers like myself about how does that feel? And it's a little, it's a little daunting sometimes. And so part of, my job is to remember when I'm, meeting with, the class of 2025, or however we describe it. And, I'm looking around the room and noticing that, the impacts of the 2024 election, that, I don't feel out of place. I don't feel unwelcome. I feel like a colleague. And so we all need to do that for all of us, to have a functional legislature. And I think that you've seen, for example, just if Lieutenant Governor is saying something, he's coordinating with the governor. And, I think that it was necessary, and it's valuable, and this is what lieutenant governors can do. This is what makes them really valuable pieces of, the puzzle. And especially if they're working sort of in concert with the governor and the governor's office. And so I'm appreciative of that. And I think it's also helped a lot of legislators feel like, okay, we're looking at two prominent cases here, two issues. They're not the same. And frankly, it's also helped us have conversations about, well, what do I actually know about immigration? It's like, oh, this is complicated. This has been used by every presidential administration for, to advance purposes. And it's not fair. It's not easy. We've all watched Dragnet growing up, and we can mostly get through the Miranda rights, but it is important to remember what it's like to hear the Miranda rights in a language that isn't your first language, or what choices you have to make, and when you make choices that you then cannot subsequently unmake. So there was recently on Thursday night a panel with some immigration lawyers that was from 5 to 7 p.m. It was on May Day, and which was nice. There was a lot going on May 1st, as you may have heard. We, did concur with the Senate on Proposition 3 to amend the Constitution, and that will not be amended unless the people are willing to do so, and that's in November. But something pertaining to labor rights and organized labor, which is something that Vermont's a little different from a lot of the Northeast in that respect. We can talk more about that should you wish. But the point, to get back to immigration stuff, was that it was really valuable to have some lawyers in the room on the panel, and Democrats, Republicans, members of the public were all in attendance to just learn a little bit. It's more relevant in our lives than maybe it had been in the past. The detention of 8 dairy workers up in Berkshire at Vermont's largest dairy. There's 4,700 head there, like of dairy, of cattle to milk, and that's not something that we just are able to do with the workforce in the state. And so we have to be thinking through the consequences, and also there were 30 individuals, non, U.S. citizens, 22 of whom had the paperwork in order, 8 of whom did not. But those 30 individuals are performing a vital function for a state that really highly prizes its continued dairy, production. So it allows us to see, I hope, to see ourselves as we really are, to see where we rely on other individuals, as Representative Morrissey said, where due process, where we can feel confidence in due process, understanding that it's not simple, but it shouldn't be cynical. And, I think that's with those two prominent cases, there's different facts in play. And I valued the governor's assertion that if you have a reason to hold him, please tell us what those reasons are. We have seen an administration, a federal administration, that's willing to give pretty crummy answers and things that just don't pass the smell test. So I admire anyone in the state who is, whether they serve in the legislature or in the executive branch or just citizens, like all of us are, who has taken the time to voice concerns, to show support where possible, and to get engaged with elected officials, the federal delegation, at the state level, at the local level, to be sure that we all are understanding what's at stake, and who is at stake, because it's a bigger, one of the big things that came out of that panel is that if you're within 100 miles of the border, you're at the border. And so that's by sea, by land. And that's an important thing for us to realize. I have a different relationship with immigration, authorities when I'm in Pownell than I do when I'm in Montpelier, because I'm within 100 miles when I'm in Montpelier. And that's an important thing for us to realize, that that's always been that way. That isn't some new thing, but it's just shining a light on a part of life, of citizenship or of non-citizenship, of shining light on what rights are, how we acquire them, how we lose them. That I think is, as far as understanding what our constitutions provide for, what they don't, what our administrations provide for, what they can't. That's good for all of us to see, and it's a shame that we have to see it through a lens of cynicism at this time.
I think that's a really important point, the fact that, and we hosted an event here at the Multicultural Center yesterday with Jill Martin-Diaz, the executive director of the Vermont Science Assistance Project, who I am sure was one of the lawyers who was part of the panel that you were able to attend. And one of the points that they made is exactly that. This is not new. This is just a more amplified and newer context for something that has always happened. And that for every single case like Moussa Mehdawi that gets a lot of attention and that is sort of easy to parse out, there are dozens of other cases that are the day in, day out work of attorneys like them to understand the context for and then move forward with. Bringing that to you, Representative Durfee, within Bennington County, there are many, many people who are legally in the United States but are not yet citizens, who have asylee status or refugee status, special immigrant visas, or one of those other green card holders who are here in the United States legally, or, as has been the case with some of the changes on the federal level, people who arrived legally through a process that was in place at the time but now no longer exists, who are here and are very concerned as residents of the county. To Representative Cooper's point, here a lot of Bennington County is not within 100 miles of a border, but it is one of the only places in Vermont at which that is true. But as a representative, what would you say to residents of the county who are very afraid right now because of the news that they see not only here in Vermont but nationally, and what's happening to people who have statuses that look like theirs?
Yeah, I attended that panel that Jonathan mentioned, and Jill Martin-Diaz was one of the attorneys who presented, and it was eye-opening. And yeah, to the 100-mile point, we're how far is it to Canada from here? 130 miles maybe. So we're south of that line. But she also pointed, or one of the other panelists pointed out, that it's also 100 miles from the seashore. So if you're in Brattleboro, for example, again, I don't know how far by as crow flies it is to Hampton or the North Shore, but we are in Bennington County probably one of the only places in Vermont that is not subject to the same border patrol um, interrogations and so forth that we would be otherwise. I a couple of other things that I'm just going to remember and pass along that I think were really helpful from that conversation, that panel, and maybe you heard similar things last night. But yes, I mean, I think we should all be afraid, whether we are green card holders or asylees, whether we're within 100 miles or not. The actions that have been taken, the high profile, deliberately high profile actions they're totally outrageous, unconstitutional for someone's freedom of speech essentially being violated, something they've written or said peacefully. We cannot tolerate that. We cannot allow that to go uncontested. And Vermonters have not been tolerating it. To our collective credit, have not been allowing it to go uncontested. And we need to continue to do that. The message I think that I would want to share is that, yes, I mean, it's completely understandable if you were a member of one of those vulnerable populations to be afraid, but don't be. It's or try not to be. It's unlikely that simply for manpower reasons, and for the fact that most of the people who are being detained here are being selected for specific reasons, because they have been profiled by the Trump administration and feel that they get the most bang for the buck out of it. And what they're hoping to do is make people afraid. And they're hoping that people will self-deport, because the government does not have the ability to deport 12 million undocumented people in this country. They simply can't do that. So Yes, we need to recognize those of us who are allies, who are not in those immediately vulnerable populations. I think we need to recognize that it's a terrifying time, and be do what we can to help people, but would also say, to the best that you can, don't try not to live your life in constant fear. That's what the Trump administration wants you to do. Uh, I'll add, and Jonathan talked about the dairy workers in the northern along the Canadian border who are being detained. That the vast majority of agriculture workers in this country are not authorized to be working. And that applies to construction workers too. So many of the 12 or 13 million immigrants who are here without the proper documentation, they're agriculture workers. They're feeding us. They are essential workers. They're building or would like to build the homes that we so desperately say we need, not just here in Vermont, but across the country. It would be not just a practical impossibility to deport anywhere close to that number of people, but we would not be able to eat. Period. It's not just people milking cows, it's all the food that is grown and produced across the country. Majority of that is done by the people who are being vilified day in, day out by Trump and his administration. So by selectively targeting a few people and making them into news stories that dominate the coverage, people who aren't paying too much attention will think, oh, good, he's doing what he promised to do, to round up immigrants and get them out of the country. It's a sad thing.
And I do want to follow up on one specific point that you raised, and also Representative Morrissey that you were pointing to. And Representative Morrissey, I know we only have a couple minutes left, but I want to give you the last word, which is the underlying constitutional rights and protections that do feel like they are being threatened at the moment. You referenced due process. Representative Durfee, you were talking about First Amendment rights. I know that in the wake of a lot of these actions, and out of an abundance of concern and with an eye on harm reduction, there have been institutions. I know this happened over at SUNY Albany, where students who are in some type of legal resident but not yet citizens were advised not to take part in any type of demonstration or protest. So basically advised not to use their First Amendment rights to freedom of speech or assembly. And that families of those students were also brought into meetings and were presented with this information and that advice. Those kinds of conversations are happening around the country. Just curious for sort of your final thoughts on some of those constitutional questions.
Well, again, it saddens me that we're, at this divide that, you would want individuals to be able to partake, especially like as you're talking about a college, to partake, in hopefully what will be hopefully what would be non-violent, protests. And I think that is everyone's right. It's a concern when any protest or any type of rally becomes violent. I look at, and folks seem to even more so overreact. And again, I so have always appreciated that, those are rights we have and should have to be able to voice. But again, hopefully in a peaceful manner. Yes, people get very passionate, and I totally understand that. But I would hope for, any of the rallies that do take place, that they can at least be peaceful. Yes, have your First Amendment rights as people should have, and be able to, but when it becomes violent, that's a bit of a challenge. That's more than a bit of a challenge for all sides of the discussion. And there shouldn't be sides. People should be able to have their, be part of a process, and hopefully to stay nonviolent.
I appreciate ending on that note, and I think that is something that we have returned to as a theme many times on this show, and I think we see it even within today's conversation, where so much of what's happening on the state level with the budget process is about conversation, compromise, discussion, and hopefully a consensus outcome, and that is arrived at through the ability of everyone to have their voices heard and to speak with each other, and that is something that does feel like it is sometimes missing. So I appreciate ending on that note about there for a lot of the underlying questions, there shouldn't really be sides. There should be that ability to come together around fundamental beliefs. So thank you all for an excellent conversation, and we'll do it all again soon.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you, Jack.
Have a good day, everyone.